The soft chime of the boutique's front door echoed through the quiet luxury store as the afternoon sun filtered through the tall glass windows. Inside, everything sparkled. Rows of pristine handbags, glass cases filled with gold watches and diamonds, and carefully folded designer clothes on spotless shelves. It was the kind of place where the carpet felt too soft under your feet, where every item had a price tag, so small it was almost as though the numbers were whispered, not shown. The air smelled faintly of perfume, expensive and delicate. To the outside world, it was just another upscale store on a city street. But for those inside, it was a different world, one of wealth, exclusivity, and silent judgment. The woman stepped inside with a quiet confidence, her heels clicking lightly on the marble floor. She was stunning in a way that turned heads without her even trying, a woman in her late 30s, poised and graceful. Her black blazer was sharp, tailored perfectly to her figure, and her matching trousers flowed like silk. A pair of sunglasses rested on top of her head, her natural curls framing her face as she surveyed the store. If anyone paid attention, they would have noticed the details that spoke of quiet wealth. The diamond-studded earrings that caught the light, the designer watch on her wrist, the unmistakable elegance in the way she carried herself. But no one in the store seemed to look past her skin. Two employees stood behind the counter, their conversation falling silent as their eyes followed her. One of them, a younger woman with blonde hair pulled into a tight bun, tilted her head slightly, whispering to the other, who nodded slowly. The shift was subtle but clear, suspicion masked under professional smiles. The woman, unaware or perhaps unconcerned, walked toward the handbags. Her fingers brushed against the soft leather of a purse as she inspected it with quiet appreciation, her face calm and focused. In the far corner of the store, a man entered, tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a crisp navy blue uniform. A police officer. His presence broke the boutique's stillness, though he moved quietly, as if not to disturb the fragile air of luxury. The officer's gaze swept across the room until it landed on her. Something in his posture changed, a subtle tension in his shoulders, the way his hand drifted closer to his belt. "Excuse me, ma'am," he called out, his voice firm, cutting through the quiet. The woman turned to face him, her expression neutral, though there was a flicker of surprise in her eyes. She tilted her head slightly, as if assessing the situation before speaking. "Yes, can I help you?" Her tone was polite, clear and unshaken, but it didn't seem to register with the officer. He stepped closer, his boots thudding heavily on the marble. The employees behind the counter watched silently, their wide eyes darting back and forth between the woman and the officer. Other customers had paused, some pretending to browse while sneaking glances at the unfolding scene. "We've had a report about suspicious activity in the area," the officer said, his words clipped. "May I ask what you're doing here?" The woman blinked, clearly taken aback. "Excuse me." The officer's tone grew sharper, less patient. "Do you have a reason to be here, ma'am? Are you planning on purchasing something?" For a brief moment, the woman didn't respond. It wasn't that she didn't know what to say. It was the disbelief, the sheer absurdity of the question that stalled her. She glanced at the store clerks, who averted their eyes, suddenly busying themselves behind the counter. The truth hit her in that moment, sharp and stinging. "Is there a reason I shouldn't be here?" she asked finally, her voice steady but cool. The officer didn't answer her question. Instead, he took another step forward, his presence looming. "I'm going to need to see some identification." She stared at him, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Identification? For what?" "Standard procedure," he replied, his hand hovering near the radio on his shoulder, as if anticipating resistance. "Standard procedure," she repeated, her tone now tinged with incredulity. Around them, the boutique had fallen into complete silence. Other customers were watching openly now, some whispering, others pulling out their phones, their cameras quietly capturing the moment. The woman could feel their eyes on her, burning like invisible weights pressing into her skin. "Look," the officer said, his patience clearly wearing thin. "I don't want to make this difficult. Just show me some ID, and we can sort this out." "Sort what out?" She shot back, her voice sharper now. "I haven't done anything wrong. I walked into a store. I looked at a purse. Is that illegal?" The officer's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one more time. Show me some identification." The woman didn't move. She stood her ground, her gaze steady as she looked directly at him. "I don't have to show you anything. I'm not breaking any laws." Her refusal seemed to be the final straw. Without warning, the officer reached for her wrist, his grip firm as he pulled her arm. "That's it. You're coming with me." The room erupted. Gasps filled the boutique as customers scrambled to get out of the way, knocking into displays and shelves in their rush to avoid the scene. The woman struggled against the officer's hold, her voice strong but shaking with anger. "I haven't done anything. Let me go." "Stop resisting," the officer snapped, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. By now, several phones were recording. The employees behind the counter watched helplessly, their faces pale as the scene unfolded before them. One of them finally stammered, "Maybe we should call someone," but her voice was lost under the commotion. The officer forced the woman's hands behind her back, snapping the cold metal cuffs onto her wrists. Her face flushed with anger, but she didn't cry out. Instead, she turned her head, looking straight into one of the cameras recording her. Her voice was low, but clear enough for anyone nearby to hear. "You're making a mistake," she said, her words calm despite the chaos around her. "A big mistake." The officer didn't respond. He guided her toward the exit, his grip firm as he led her past the stunned customers, their faces frozen in shock. As they stepped outside, the cameras followed, the bright afternoon sun hitting her face as the officer walked her toward his patrol car. And in that moment, the woman spoke again, her voice steady, almost chilling in its clarity. "Do you know who I am?" The officer scoffed, his expression dismissive as he opened the car door. "I don't care who you are." She looked at him then, really looked at him. And for the first time, there was something in her gaze that made him pause. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was something else. "You will," she said quietly. "Trust me, you will." As the door closed behind her, the cameras caught every second, the videos already spreading across the internet, gathering likes, shares, and heated discussions. Inside the store, the employees whispered nervously among themselves, already regretting their silence. Outside, the officer leaned against his patrol car, suddenly uneasy as he replayed her words in his mind. "Do you know who I am?" He didn't know. Not yet. But soon, the entire world would. The ride to the police station was tense and silent, the kind of silence that settles deep in your bones and makes every second feel like an hour. The woman sat in the back seat of the patrol car, her hands still cuffed, the cold metal digging into her wrists. She didn't speak, didn't fight, didn't ask any questions. She just stared out the window, her expression calm and unreadable. It was the kind of calm that didn't come from resignation, but from someone who knew something no one else did. The officer, sitting stiffly in the driver's seat, kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror. There was something about her that made him uneasy, though he didn't want to admit it. She didn't behave the way most people did in this situation. There was no shouting, no pleading, no desperation, only silence. Her words replayed in his mind like a broken record. "Do you know who I am?" He had brushed it off at the time, but now, with each passing minute, that question sat heavier and heavier on his chest. Outside, the city streets rolled by, bustling with life. People walked the sidewalks, carrying shopping bags and coffees, completely unaware of what had just happened. But somewhere in the distance, the buzz of phones vibrating and news alerts pinging had already begun. Videos of the incident were spreading, clips of the officer grabbing her, the sound of handcuffs clicking, and her parting words, "You're making a big mistake." By the time they reached the station, the quiet was suffocating. The officer parked the car, got out, and opened the door for her. He guided her out of the car, still gripping her arm tightly, though she didn't resist. Her heels clicked against the pavement as they entered through the station doors. Inside, the hum of conversations, ringing phones, and footsteps seemed to pause as the two of them walked through. Officers at their desks turned their heads. Some looked at her, then back at the officer, their curiosity unspoken but visible. He led her to a small, dimly lit room with a metal table and 2 chairs. She sat down slowly, her expression still impossibly composed. The officer stood for a moment, unsure what to do next, before finally stepping out to speak with his captain. "Got her on suspicion of theft," he said quickly when the captain asked for details. The captain, an older man with graying hair and sharp eyes, frowned. "Theft? Where's the evidence?" She was acting suspicious, the officer insisted, though his voice was less certain now. The employees called it in, said she didn't look like she belonged there. The captain's frown deepened. "You arrested her because she didn't look like she belonged there." The officer's career flashed before his eyes. He had assumed so much about her, her place, her status, her worth, without ever stopping to see her. And now the entire world would see him for exactly what he had done. The station buzzed with an uncomfortable energy, as though the air itself had thickened after the woman walked out. Officers exchanged uneasy glances, whispering in small clusters, the tension palpable. No one said her name, not yet, but they all knew who she was now. The officer who had arrested her sat at his desk, staring blankly at the paperwork in front of him. His hands were clammy, the pen shaking slightly between his fingers. The reality of the situation weighed on him like a stone. He hadn't just made a mistake, he had opened a door that couldn't be closed. Meanwhile, outside the station, the story was gaining momentum. News outlets ran headlines that grew sharper with every passing hour. Police arrest prominent CEO in luxury store. A case of racial profiling. The footage taken by bystanders was dissected frame by frame on social media. People commented on the officer's tone, the unnecessary aggression, and the woman's composed but powerful words. Strangers debated fiercely in the comments section. This was pure bias. If she was white, this wouldn't have happened. Unacceptable treatment of someone just existing. Others were less sympathetic, their comments defensive. The officer was just doing his job. Maybe she was acting suspicious. Why didn't she just show her ID? But no matter the side, the conversation wasn't stopping. The story had struck a nerve, spreading far beyond the city limits. At her penthouse apartment, the woman sat in her living room, her phone buzzing incessantly on the table. Text messages, calls, emails, it all poured in, a flood of people wanting updates, wanting to offer support, or, in some cases, to apologize. A news anchor's voice drifted from the TV across the room, the footage from the boutique playing on repeat. She didn't look at it. Instead, she gazed out the floor-to-ceiling windows, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. A knock at the door broke the silence. She didn't need to ask who it was. The sharp, no-nonsense knock told her everything. "Come in," she called. A tall man in his early 40s entered, dressed sharply in a charcoal suit, his silver-rimmed glasses perched perfectly on his nose. Her attorney. He placed his briefcase on the table and sighed as he sat across from her. "I've been fielding calls all afternoon," he said, pulling out a stack of papers. "This is everywhere. People are furious." She turned her gaze toward him, calm as ever. "Good." He raised an eyebrow. "I just want to confirm. Are you sure you want to move forward with this? Once we take formal action, the media circus will only grow. It's not going away anytime soon." She leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. "They humiliated me," she said simply. "He saw me, and without knowing a single thing about me, he assumed the worst. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about everyone who's been treated like they don't belong. Everyone who didn't have a camera to prove it." Her attorney nodded, as though he'd expected nothing less. "Then we'll file the civil suit first thing tomorrow. I'll also draft a formal statement for the press, something strong but measured." She nodded but didn't respond, her mind already racing ahead. The truth was, she didn't need the money. She didn't need apologies whispered from behind closed doors. What she wanted was accountability, something that felt so rare in these situations, where the system always seemed to protect its own. At the police station, the captain was working damage control. He called the officer into his office, closing the door behind him. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" the captain asked, his voice low but sharp. The officer shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his palms sweating. "I thought she was acting suspicious." "You thought?" The captain snapped. "You didn't have a reason. You had a feeling. You arrested a woman without cause, and that woman happens to be one of the most influential CEOs in the country. Do you know how bad this looks for us? For the entire department." The officer tried to respond, but every word he thought to say felt hollow, pointless. The captain sighed heavily and leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk. "You're on leave effective immediately," he said. "And believe me, this is just the beginning. Internal Affairs will be investigating this, and you better hope they find a way to clean up the mess you made." The officer left the office in a daze, his ears ringing. Other officers glanced at him as he passed, their expressions a mix of judgment and pity. For the first time in his career, he felt small, exposed, like someone had pulled back the curtain to reveal exactly who he was. Over the next few days, the story refused to die. News anchors interviewed legal experts who broke down the situation, explaining what wrongful arrest and civil rights violations meant. Activists spoke passionately on panels, pointing out that what happened to her was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern that played out in communities across the country. Everywhere the officer turned, he saw himself, on screens, in headlines, on social media. His name wasn't released to the public yet, but it was only a matter of time. Meanwhile, the boutique at the center of it all was also facing backlash. Videos circulated showing the employees whispering and watching the woman before the arrest. Why didn't they step in? People demanded. Protesters began gathering outside the store, holding signs that read, "You're the problem," and "We all belong here." The boutique released a carefully worded statement apologizing for the incident, but it only fueled the anger. Inside her office, the woman sat across from a reporter for a national news outlet, agreeing to her first public interview. The reporter, a younger woman with dark curls and a serious expression, leaned forward. "You're an incredibly successful businesswoman, and you've broken barriers in your field. But what happened to you has sparked a much larger conversation. What message do you want people to take from this? The woman considered her words carefully before speaking. Success doesn't shield you from prejudice, she said quietly. What happened to me happens every day to people who don't have my resources or my platform. People who get ignored, who never get an apology, and who never get justice. That's why I'm speaking out, because I want people to see it, to feel uncomfortable about it, and to ask themselves why this keeps happening. The interview aired that night, her words playing on TVs and phones across the country. People shared clips of it on social media, calling her brave, strong, and powerful. But even as the tides turned in her favor, she knew the real fight was only just beginning. The officer sat alone in his apartment, staring at the interview on the screen. Her face was calm, resolute, and unshaken. He turned off the TV and sank back into the couch, the weight of everything pressing down on him. For the first time, he wondered what made him see her the way he did that day. Why his instinct had been to question her, to doubt her presence in a store she clearly belonged in. The truth made him feel sick, because deep down, he already knew the answer. And somewhere in the city, the woman sat at her desk, watching the same interview play back on her computer. Outside, the world was still talking, still shouting, still asking questions. She closed her laptop slowly, her mind clear. This wasn't over. Not yet. And she would make sure no one forgot her name or what had happened to her. The days that followed felt like the city itself had caught fire. Everywhere you looked, her story was there. On TV screens, newspaper covers, social media feeds, and overheard conversations in coffee shops and buses. People weren't just talking anymore. They were demanding answers. Protesters filled the sidewalks outside the boutique, their voices carrying down the streets. Signs held high with phrases like, "We belong everywhere," and "End racial profiling now." News vans parked outside, their reporters setting up cameras, narrating the events as they unfolded. Inside the boutique, the once quiet and pristine space now felt cold and empty. Sales had plummeted overnight, the doors practically swinging open, and shut only for reporters and frustrated customers demanding to speak to a manager. The employees who had whispered that day were nowhere to be found, likely placed on indefinite leave to keep them out of sight. The store's carefully worded apologies only fueled more anger, their hollow tone doing little to calm the storm that had now grown beyond their control. At the police department, the officer at the center of the controversy sat in a small windowless room, waiting. It had been days since he'd been placed on leave, but it felt like weeks. He was no longer in uniform. Instead, he wore a simple dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows as he stared at the wall in front of him. His phone buzzed nonstop with missed calls and texts, some from friends, others from people he didn't even know, all of them asking the same thing. What were you thinking? He couldn't answer them because he didn't know anymore. He had been so certain that day, certain he was in the right, that his instinct was enough. But now, replaying every second in his mind, he felt the cracks spreading through his certainty, splitting it apart until nothing remained. The videos of the arrest were still playing everywhere, the woman's voice haunting him. "You're making a big mistake." He had laughed at her words then, dismissing them as arrogance. But now they echoed in his mind like a warning he had failed to heed. Across the city, she was preparing. The woman sat in her office, surrounded by her team, attorneys, PR strategists, and trusted friends, each of them helping her navigate what came next. Papers were scattered across the table in front of them, details of the civil suit ready to be filed. The next step was clear, but the weight of it pressed heavily on her shoulders. "You don't have to do this," her attorney said quietly as the room fell silent. "You've already done enough." The public is on your side. You've made your point." She looked at him, her expression sharp and unwavering. "I'm not doing this for attention," she said firmly. "I'm doing this so no one else has to go through what I did." Her attorney nodded, understanding her resolve. The fight wasn't just personal anymore, it was bigger than her. The story had become a symbol, a reflection of a much larger issue that people couldn't ignore any longer. It was about power, assumptions, and what it meant to belong. And for every person who supported her, there were others pushing back, clinging to their defenses, their discomfort making them louder than ever. On the evening news, a reporter stood in front of the boutique, her voice steady as she addressed the camera. Tensions remain high tonight as protests continue. Earlier today, the police department issued a statement confirming that Officer James Monroe has been placed under internal investigation for his role in the wrongful arrest. The department has yet to comment further on the matter. Inside his small apartment, the officer watched the news with a sinking feeling in his chest. His name was out now, flashed across the screen, attached to headlines, trending on social media. He was no longer just a faceless figure in a uniform. People knew who he was, and they had already made up their minds about him. He turned off the TV and ran a hand over his face, the weight of it all pressing down on him like a boulder. His mind drifted back to that day again, the way she had looked at him, calm and unshaken, even as he grabbed her wrist. Why had he been so quick to doubt her? He didn't have an answer, but deep down, the truth clawed at him. He had seen what he wanted to see. He had assumed, and now the whole world saw him for exactly what he'd done. As the storm grew louder, the woman made her move. Her team finalized the suit and issued a statement to the press. The message was clear and unflinching. Accountability was coming. Reporters read her words aloud on air. No one should be judged or targeted based on how they look. This isn't about me. It's about a system that must change. I will not stay silent. Her words spread like wildfire, sparking debates across the country. People who had once ignored stories like this now found themselves questioning everything. News panels filled with experts and commentators discussing racial profiling, wrongful arrests, and what it meant for people of color to navigate spaces where they were seen as out of place. Others doubled down on their denial, saying she had overreacted, that the officer had only been doing his job. At the center of it all, the tension simmered, waiting to boil over. The civil suit was now public knowledge, and with it came even more scrutiny. Cameras followed her every move, capturing her as she walked confidently into meetings, her face calm and determined. The footage from the boutique replayed alongside her interviews, her voice unshaken. "This isn't just about me. It's about what happens when people refuse to see our humanity." At the same time, the officer's world continued to crumble. He couldn't leave his apartment without seeing someone staring at him, their gaze sharp with judgment. Neighbors avoided him. Strangers whispered when he walked past. His colleagues, some of whom had been his friends, kept their distance, their silence louder than any words they could have spoken. He had become a symbol, too, but not the kind he wanted to be. As the hearing date approached, the city felt on edge, as though everyone was waiting for the next move. Protesters camped outside the courthouse steps, their chants echoing through the streets. News vans parked in rows, their reporters ready to cover every detail. Inside the courthouse, preparations were underway. Attorneys shuffling through papers, reporters whispering into cameras, and security ensuring no one got too close. In her apartment, the woman stood by the window, looking out at the city below. The sun was setting, casting streaks of gold and orange across the skyline. Her phone buzzed with another message, a note of support from someone she didn't even know. She allowed herself a small smile. The fight was almost here, and she was ready. Meanwhile, in his apartment across town, the officer sat alone, staring at his phone as it buzzed with notifications. The weight of what was coming made it hard to breathe. He knew he'd have to face her again, face the courtroom, the cameras, the questions he couldn't answer. And for the first time, he wondered if he could ever undo the damage he caused. The city held its breath as the days ticked by. The tension grew unbearable, like a storm cloud hanging low in the sky, ready to unleash its fury. Everyone watched, everyone waited, because no matter which side they were on, they knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The city's tension had reached its peak, the anticipation building like a storm cloud ready to burst. News anchors recapped every moment leading up to the civil hearing, analyzing footage of the woman's wrongful arrest, her powerful interviews, and the relentless protests outside the boutique. On social media, the conversation had grown louder, more polarized, with everyone taking sides. Supporters flooded timelines with messages like "Justice is overdue" and "Change starts here." Critics fired back with dismissive comments, questioning her motives and defending the officer's actions. But the louder the debate became, the clearer it was that this wasn't just another news story. It had become a symbol, one that carried the weight of something much larger. The morning of the hearing, the courthouse steps were swarmed with protesters, reporters, and curious onlookers. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust into faces, and voices filled the air in a chaotic mix of chants, questions, and shouted opinions. Inside the courthouse, the woman walked purposefully, her expression calm and focused. Her team surrounded her, each step deliberate as they entered the courtroom. She wore a sharp navy suit, her presence commanding without needing to say a word. The officer, on the other hand, sat stiffly at the defendant's table. His face was pale, his hands fidgeting under the table as he avoided looking at anyone. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension as the proceedings began. The woman's attorney wasted no time, presenting the facts with sharp precision. "What happened to my client was not an accident," he said, his voice firm as he turned toward the jury. "It was not a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate assumption, a judgment made about her based on nothing but her appearance. And it speaks to a systemic issue, one that cannot be ignored any longer." The officer's defense attorney countered, trying to deflect blame. "My client acted on the information he had at the time," he argued. He was responding to a report made by the store employees. This was not about race or bias. It was about doing his job. But as the arguments went back and forth, it was clear the defense was scrambling. The footage of the arrest was played again, the officer grabbing her, the look on her face, her calm but cutting words. Every second of it was displayed on the screen for the jury and the world to see. The silence in the room was heavy as everyone watched, the truth undeniable in its clarity. And then, just when it seemed like the case was moving toward its natural conclusion, there was a knock at the courtroom door. The bailiff stepped in quietly, leaning in to whisper something to the judge, who frowned before nodding. The woman's attorney looked confused, exchanging glances with his team. Even the officer's defense seemed momentarily thrown off. The judge cleared his throat, his voice echoing through the room. "It appears we have new evidence relevant to this case," he announced. "A witness has come forward." The courtroom stirred, a wave of murmurs breaking through the tension. The woman's attorney turned to her, a look of surprise and uncertainty on his face. She remained still, her expression unreadable. The officer sat up straighter, his brow furrowing as he glanced toward the back of the courtroom. Who could it be? The doors opened, and a man entered. He was older, with graying hair and tired eyes, dressed in a simple dark suit. He walked slowly toward the front of the room, the sound of his shoes echoing in the silence. He stopped at the witness stand, raising his hand to be sworn in. "State your name for the record," the judge said. The man cleared his throat. "Andrew Whitman," he replied, his voice steady. The name seemed to ripple through the room like a shockwave. Reporters in the gallery leaned forward, whispering into their phones. The woman's attorney froze, as if trying to place the name. Even the officer's face fell slightly, his eyes widening with something close to recognition. "Mr. Whitman," the prosecutor said carefully, stepping forward. "Can you tell us why you're here today?" The man nodded slowly, his hands gripping the edge of the stand. "I was a store manager at the boutique that day," he said, his voice low but clear. The air in the courtroom seemed to freeze. Every eye turned to him. The employees who had called the police had been kept anonymous up until now, but here he was, one of them, finally stepping into the light. The woman watched him carefully, her gaze unflinching. The officer shifted in his seat, his discomfort clear. "Go on," the prosecutor urged. Mr. Whitman took a deep breath, his expression troubled. "I've been carrying this for weeks," he said quietly, "and I can't keep it to myself anymore. The truth is, we didn't really see anything suspicious that day." A gasp rippled through the room. The officer's attorney shot up. "Objection." "Overruled," the judge said, his gaze sharp. "The witness may continue." Mr. Whitman pressed on, his voice shaking now. "She walked into the store like anyone else. She looked at the merchandise just like every other customer. But one of my employees made a comment, said she didn't look like she could afford anything here. I didn't correct them. I didn't say anything. And then, when she lingered by the handbags, someone suggested we call the police. I let it happen. I didn't think." He paused, his voice breaking slightly. "I didn't think it would go that far." The woman's expression didn't change, but her attorney stood taller now, his confidence returning. The officer sat rigidly, his jaw clenched as though each word hit him like a hammer. The room was stunned, the weight of Mr. Whitman's admission sinking in. "You're saying there was no suspicious activity?" the prosecutor asked firmly. "No," Mr. Whitman replied, shaking his head. "There wasn't. We profiled her. We assumed things about her. And I let it happen." The tension in the room snapped like a taut wire. The officer's attorney sat back down, his face pale, while the reporters scrambled to type updates into their phones. This new testimony had shattered the defense's already fragile case. The woman sat motionless, her gaze fixed on Mr. Whitman. She didn't look angry or triumphant, just steady, as though she had known this truth all along, and had been waiting for everyone else to see it, too. Outside the courthouse, news of the testimony spread like wildfire. The protesters' chants grew louder, their energy feeding off this new revelation. Cameras flashed, microphones captured sound bites, and social media exploded with the words, "No suspicious activity." Inside the courtroom, the officer sat frozen, his mind racing. This wasn't just about one arrest anymore. It was about everything. It was about assumptions, about choices, about what had led him to that moment. And now the world was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. As the judge called for a recess, the woman stood slowly, turning to glance at the officer for the first time that day. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, the officer saw it, the weight of everything he'd taken from her, everything his choices had unleashed. She didn't say a word, but she didn't need to. The truth was out, and there was no going back. The next move would decide everything. The courtroom was still buzzing with whispers as the recess ended. The weight of Mr. Whitman's testimony had shifted everything. What had started as a battle of narratives, a question of intent, judgment, and authority, had now turned into something undeniable. The truth was out, spoken plainly for everyone to hear. The woman sat back at her table, her face calm, but her steady breathing revealed the tension she held just beneath the surface. She knew they were close to something, but close wasn't enough, not yet. The officer sat across the room, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. He hadn't moved much since the testimony, his hands resting limply on his lap. The words "we assumed things about her" replayed in his head on a loop. Those words clung to him because he realized that they weren't just about that day. They were about him. For years, his instincts had guided him, and he had always trusted them. But now those instincts had failed him. They had failed everyone. The judge re-entered the courtroom, his robe billowing slightly as he settled back into his seat. The crowd fell silent, every person on edge, waiting to see how this would end. The woman's attorney rose, his voice calm but deliberate. "Your Honor, the testimony we've heard today confirms what we've argued from the beginning. My client was targeted unfairly, without reason or evidence, solely because of assumptions made about her appearance. The actions of the store and the responding officer violated her rights and left her humiliated and traumatized. This cannot be brushed aside." The defense attorney stood next, his voice faltering slightly as he tried to regain control. "While we acknowledge Mr. Whitman's testimony, we must also recognize that Officer Monroe acted on information provided to him. He responded to a call, as any officer would, and did his job to the best of his ability." The woman's attorney quickly cut in. Did his job? By arresting an innocent woman based on assumptions. He turned sharply to face the jury. This is about accountability, not excuses. It's about what happens when we let bias, unchecked and unchallenged, dictate our actions. The officer closed his eyes for a moment, the words slicing through him like a knife. He could feel the eyes of the room on him, waiting for a reaction he couldn't give. The judge paused, his gaze sweeping over the room. "Before we proceed further, does either side have anything additional to present?" There was silence. Then, to everyone's surprise, the woman stood up. Her attorney looked at her, startled, but she gave him a brief nod. The courtroom murmurs grew louder as she walked toward the stand, her heels tapping softly on the floor. She raised her right hand, was sworn in, and sat down. Her gaze swept over the courtroom, pausing briefly on the officer before settling on the jury. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but it carried the weight of everything she'd been through. "I want to speak for myself," she began. "When I walked into that store, I wasn't thinking about what I looked like or whether I belonged. I was just a woman looking at a bag, a simple act that, for so many, wouldn't have been questioned. But for me, that moment turned into something else entirely. I was judged before I spoke a word. I was assumed guilty of something I didn't do. And the truth is, I'm not the only one. This happens every day to people whose stories you'll never hear." Her words hung in the air like smoke, heavy and inescapable. She turned her gaze to the officer now, holding it. "I don't hate you," she said softly, surprising the room into silence. "I don't think you woke up that morning planning to ruin my day or your own. But what you did matters. You didn't stop to think. You didn't question your assumptions. And because of that, you humiliated me." The officer swallowed hard, his throat dry. For the first time, he felt smaller than his uniform, as though the weight of it was finally sinking in. She turned back to the jury. I'm here because I refuse to stay quiet. I refuse to let this keep happening to others. Accountability isn't about punishment. It's about learning, about change. And that starts when we face the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it is. The courtroom was silent as she stepped down. Even the officer's attorney didn't try to challenge her words. What could he say? The truth had been spoken, and it hung in the air, unshakable. As the closing arguments wrapped up, the jury was dismissed to deliberate. The room emptied out slowly, the energy tense and restless. Outside, the courthouse steps were filled with protesters, cameras, and reporters, all waiting for a verdict. Inside a small room, the officer sat alone, waiting. For hours, he stared at the walls, unable to quiet the thoughts racing through his mind. He thought about his training, his assumptions, the way he had ignored the quiet voice in his head that day telling him to slow down, to think. He had chosen not to listen. And now he was here. By the time the jury returned, the sky outside had darkened, streaked with gray clouds. The courtroom filled once more, the tension so heavy it felt hard to breathe. The woman sat between her attorney and a friend, her hands folded calmly in her lap. The officer sat alone at the defense table, his eyes locked on the floor. The foreperson of the jury stood, holding the verdict in their hands. The judge nodded. Have you reached a decision? We have, Your Honor. The silence was deafening as the verdict was read aloud. For the woman, the words brought a rush of relief, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in days. She closed her eyes briefly, breathing in deeply as though reclaiming a piece of herself that had been taken. But then, as reporters rushed out to break the news and the courtroom began to clear, a quiet murmur rose in the back of the room. A clerk handed the judge a small, sealed envelope. The judge frowned, opening it and scanning its contents. His expression shifted, confusion, then something deeper, harder to read. The court will reconvene tomorrow morning, the judge announced abruptly, his tone sharp and final. There is new information that needs to be addressed. The room froze. The woman's attorney shot her a confused glance. The officer sat up, his brow furrowed, dread pooling in his stomach. The tension that had begun to lift slammed back down like a hammer. As the woman walked out of the courtroom, she couldn't help but glance back at the officer. He looked shaken now, truly shaken, as though he knew something more was coming, something no one had expected. Outside, the crowd was still chanting, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions into the night air. But she didn't answer. She didn't stop. The fight wasn't over, and whatever was in that envelope, whatever new truth had come to light, would change everything. The next morning, the city felt like it was holding its breath. News of the mysterious envelope had spread overnight, fueling speculation on television, in group chats, and across social media. People debated what it could mean, another witness, new evidence, or maybe something that would change everything. The courthouse steps were packed before sunrise, the crowd larger than ever, a mix of supporters, skeptics, and reporters scrambling to be part of the moment. The woman arrived quietly, her sharp navy suit replaced by a softer gray, though her composure remained untouched. She walked up the steps surrounded by her team, the sound of chants and camera shutters filling the cold morning air. Inside, the officer sat at the defense table, his face pale and drawn. He hadn't slept. His mind had been consumed by thoughts of what was in that envelope. It felt like another blow was coming, though he didn't know from where or why. He shifted in his seat, his eyes darting toward the woman when she entered the room. She didn't look at him, didn't need to. She had already said everything she needed to say, and her presence alone was enough to keep him on edge. The judge entered, his expression firm, and the courtroom fell silent. "We have reconvened to address new information that has come to light," he said. The clerk handed him the envelope again, and for a moment the judge looked down at its contents, as though weighing the significance of what he was about to say. "The court has received previously unseen documentation related to Officer Monroe's conduct prior to the incident in question." A murmur rippled through the room. The officer's defense attorney stiffened, while his client's face fell. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white, as the judge continued. "These records detail multiple complaints filed against Officer Monroe over the past 3 years," the judge said, his voice deliberate, unwavering. "Several of these incidents mirror the assumptions and actions at the center of this case. Though no formal action was taken at the time, these records are now being entered into the court as evidence." The room felt like it had lost all air. The defense attorney jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, this is highly prejudicial. These complaints were never substantiated." The judge raised his hand, silencing him. "The court will decide what is relevant, counselor. Sit down." The woman sat quietly at her table, her attorney whispering something in her ear, but she didn't react. She didn't need to. The weight of this new evidence was already sinking in, undeniable and heavy. The officer, meanwhile, sat frozen in his seat, staring blankly at the table as though willing himself to disappear. For the first time, he could feel the walls closing in completely. The quiet whispers he buried, complaints filed that he brushed off, doubts that he ignored, patterns he didn't want to see, were all laid bare now. They weren't rumors anymore. They weren't misunderstandings. They were proof. The woman's attorney stood, his voice calm but firm. "This documentation speaks to a larger issue," he said. "It shows a pattern of behavior, a habit of seeing guilt where there is none, of judging people based on assumptions rather than evidence. This isn't just about my client. It's about what happens when those assumptions are allowed to go unchecked, when accountability is ignored until it's too late." The courtroom fell silent again. The judge nodded and turned to the jury. His voice steady as he issued his instructions. "You have heard the evidence. You will now consider all facts presented in this case before returning your verdict." As the jury left to deliberate, the energy in the room shifted. There was nothing more to say. The truth had been laid out, raw and undeniable. The woman sat back in her seat, closing her eyes briefly, as if exhaling the weight of the fight. The officer remained still, his face expressionless, though his mind was racing. Hours passed. Outside, the crowd grew restless, chanting louder, waiting for an answer. News anchors speculated about the outcome, while scrolling comments flooded screens. Inside the courthouse, everyone waited. The woman didn't move from her seat, calm and unshaken. She had already won something, she knew that. Even if the verdict wasn't perfect, the truth had been forced into the light. People couldn't look away anymore. When the jury finally returned, the room fell silent, as if the whole world had stopped to listen. The foreperson rose, holding the slip of paper with the verdict. The woman's attorney rested a steadying hand on her shoulder, and for the first time, she allowed herself to take a slow, shaky breath. The foreperson spoke clearly. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer James Monroe, liable on all counts." The words hit the room like thunder. For a beat, no one moved. Then the murmur started, spreading like ripples in water. The officer sagged slightly, his face pale as he stared at the table. The woman's attorney squeezed her shoulder, whispering, "It's done." The woman didn't celebrate. She simply nodded, her expression calm but resolute. This wasn't a victory, it was a step forward. Accountability at long last. Outside the courthouse, the news spread quickly. The crowd erupted into cheers as reporters rushed to break the story. Officer Monroe found liable in wrongful arrest. Headlines blared. Social media exploded with reactions: relief, anger, celebration, debate. For every person cheering, there was another demanding change to a system that allowed things like this to happen. The officer left the courthouse surrounded by his attorney, the weight of his actions finally settling in. Cameras followed him, flashes reflecting in his tired eyes, but he didn't speak. There was nothing he could say. His career was over, his name now tied to something he couldn't undo. The woman stepped outside to meet the crowd, her presence met with applause and chants of her name. She walked toward the microphones set up near the courthouse steps. When she spoke, her voice was clear and steady, cutting through the noise. "This wasn't just about me," she said. "It was about what happens when we stop listening to assumptions and start seeing each other as human beings. What happened to me should never happen to anyone else. And while this case is over, the work is not. It's up to all of us to make sure change happens, real change, not just words." Her message spread across the country, resonating with those who had faced similar struggles and with those who were finally starting to understand. It was a call to action that couldn't be ignored. Later that night, in the quiet of her home, the woman sat by her window, looking out at the city lights. She thought about the fight it had taken to get here, the humiliation, the anger, the doubt. It hadn't been easy, but she knew it had been worth it. Somewhere, someone would see her story and realize they weren't alone. Somewhere, someone would think twice before making the same mistake. She picked up her phone and saw a message from a stranger. It was simple. "Thank you for speaking up. You made a difference." She smiled softly, setting the phone down. Outside, the world carried on, but something had shifted. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't finished, but it was a start. And sometimes a start was enough to change everything.